You want to know what happens when an HOA Karen messes with the wrong person? Let me tell you, it doesn't end well for her. My name's David Grant. I'm a guy who works hard, minds his own business, and doesn't get involved in drama. But when Rachel Whitmore, the HOA president, decided to take my boat while I was at work, well, let's just say I wasn't going to let that one slide. You're going to want to stick around to see what I did to make her regret it. Trust me, it's not what you'd expect. Now you might be wondering, why does my boat matter so much? It's just a boat, right? Well, that boat, it's been in my family for generations. My father, God rest his soul, bought it when I was a kid. Every summer we'd take it out on the lake. Just me, him, and the sun setting behind us. That was our time. No rules, no demands, just father and son cruising the waters, talking about life, or sometimes not talking at all. That was the way I connected with him. And when he passed away 2 years ago, that boat became the last piece of him I had left. Now Rachel Whitmore and her HOA, they think they own this whole neighborhood. They've got their hands in every pot, controlling the lawns, the paint jobs, the fences, and for some reason my boat didn't fit in with their idea of order. They're the kind of people who think they can tell you when to mow your grass, what color your shutters should be, and in my case where I can park my damn boat. So yeah, when I came home to find that my boat had been taken, I lost it. But I wasn't about to let Rachel win. That was the moment I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. If Rachel thought she could control me, she was about to get a lesson in who really runs this neighborhood. Let me make one thing clear before we dive deeper. If you've ever had an HOA try to ruin your peace of mind, you'll understand. They think they can just walk all over you, but let me tell you, you don't have to take it. In fact, if you've been through something like this, or you're dealing with an HOA nightmare right now, comment below. I want to hear your stories, because trust me, you're going to want to watch till the end to see how I got my sweet revenge. It all started on a Tuesday morning. I had just come back from work expecting a quiet evening, maybe a beer, maybe just sitting out by the dock to watch the sunset, but instead I was greeted with the most ridiculous violation notice I've ever seen. Violation notice hash 3421, unauthorized watercraft moored on community property. The fine, $500. For a boat I park on my private property, mind you. At first I thought it was some mistake. So I drove over to Rachel's house to figure out what was going on. Of course she was sitting on her porch, sipping her overpriced latte like nothing was wrong. I asked her about the fine. She didn't even look up. "Oh David, you must understand," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your boat is a violation of HOA guidelines. It's in the way, it's unsightly, and frankly, it's lowering the property values around here." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad's boat, the boat that had been passed down through generations of this family, was lowering property values. This from the woman who used to be a realtor and couldn't sell a house to save her life. "Rachel," I said, trying to keep my cool, "that boat's been here longer than your HOA. It's parked legally. It's on my property. You have no right to take it." She shrugged and then gave me that smug little smile she always wears. "Well, David, we're just enforcing the rules here. If you want to keep it, you'll need to move it. Otherwise, I'll have it impounded." I lost it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a boat. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. And Rachel, she wanted to control everything in this neighborhood. And I wasn't about to let her take away the last piece of my father's legacy. I knew right then that I couldn't fight her with words. She wasn't going to listen to reason. So I went home and thought about what to do next. I spent hours looking through the HOA bylaws, scouring the local ordinances, and talking to a lawyer friend of mine. And you know what? That's when I learned something crucial. Rachel wasn't nearly as powerful as she thought. The HOA had been running unchecked for years, passing arbitrary rules and fining people for the smallest infractions. They thought they could just walk into your life and decide what's yours. But they didn't have the legal right to tell me what to do with my property, especially when it was something as personal as my dad's boat. So I did what any reasonable person would do when pushed too far. I started planning. And believe me, I wasn't just going to get my boat back. No, I was going to make Rachel regret ever trying to mess with me. But before we get to the good part, before I made Rachel feel every ounce of the frustration she'd caused, let me tell you this. The HOA's power doesn't come from its rules. It comes from the fact that people are afraid to stand up to them. They use fear and intimidation to keep the neighbors in line, to make sure everyone plays by their rules. And for the longest time I'd let them. I'd stayed quiet, kept my head down, and let Rachel run her little show. But no more. If you're sitting there thinking about how to handle your own HOA nightmare, take it from me, you've got to stand up. You've got to push back, even if it means doing something a little outside the box. Trust me, it's worth it. So stay tuned. Things are about to get interesting. And when you see what happens next, you'll understand why you never mess with someone's family heirloom, especially when that heirloom is a boat. The day after Rachel's impromptu theft of my boat, I stood in my driveway staring at the empty space where it had been parked. The water was still reflecting the early morning light, but there was an unsettling emptiness where the boat should have been. I walked to the mailbox, pulled out the usual stack of bills, and then saw it, another letter from the HOA, this time with bold red lettering that screamed "You are gent." I didn't even need to open it. I already knew what was inside. Final warning, immediate action required regarding boat storage violation. I took the letter and crumpled it in my fist. If Rachel thought she could just roll in and snatch my boat, she was sadly mistaken. But this was more than just about the boat now. It was about control, respect. And I was done letting Rachel push me around. I went inside, slammed the door behind me, and dialed up my lawyer, Jake. He was a solid guy, smart and used to dealing with the small nasty stuff people like Rachel would pull. "Jake, I need some help," I said, my voice tight. He was quick to answer. "What's going on?" "They took my boat," I told him. "And now they're threatening to fine me again. They say I'm in violation of their rules." Jake sighed. "You know Rachel, she won't stop until she feels like she's won." I hated how right he was, but I wasn't about to back down. "Can we fight this?" I asked. "Ready to take action." Jake paused for a moment. "Legally, you've got a good case. They're pushing the boundaries of what they can enforce, but the key is you've got to be smart about it. You've got to outmaneuver her." That night, I started my research. I spent hours combing through every HOA bylaw, zoning law, and property deed I could get my hands on. As I pulled the documents together, I started to see it, the loophole. Rachel and her HOA hadn't updated their own regulations in over 10 years. They didn't even have proper legal standing on several of the areas they claimed control over, including the shoreline where my boat was parked. I leaned back in my chair, grinning. This was the break I needed, but Rachel wouldn't go down without a fight. She never did. The next day, I drove to City Hall to pull some records. If I was going to make this stick, I needed to have all my ducks in a row. By the time I left, I had everything I needed. Official documents, records proving the HOA's shaky grasp on certain community properties, and a stack of evidence that would make Rachel sweat. I made copies of everything, grabbed my files, and headed straight to the local newspaper office. "You're sure this is worth publishing?" Lisa Garland, the editor, asked me as she skimmed through the documents I handed over. "Trust me," I said, leaning on her desk. "Rachel's been abusing her power for years. I want to expose this, and I want her to know I'm done playing nice." Lisa eyed me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll get this in the next issue. Let's see if the community agrees with you." As I left the office, I could feel the walls closing in on Rachel. If I could get the community behind me, Rachel would be finished. 2 days later, the headline hit the Bayview Gazette. HOA president accused of overstepping boat dispute sparks community backlash. The article went on to detail Rachel's questionable practices, her illegal seizure of my boat, and the conflict it had caused within the neighborhood. Neighbors started calling me. They had questions, they were curious, and some even expressed their support. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The next day, Rachel knocked on my door. Her face was a picture of frustration, her perfect curls more disheveled than usual, and her posture stiff with anger. "David," she started, a smile that wasn't really a smile twitching at her lips. "I think we need to talk." I crossed my arms. "I'm listening." She stepped forward, her tone venomous. "You've made a mockery of this neighborhood. The press, the petitions, this is getting out of hand. You're making enemies, David. You've forced my hand, and I'm not going to let you disrupt the peace here anymore." I raised an eyebrow. "You already stole my boat. Don't come here pretending you're the one defending the peace." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this. Maybe you should start regretting the way you've been treating people in this neighborhood." I shot back, because I'm not backing down. The days that followed were tense. The community was divided. Some people supported Rachel, but more and more people were starting to see her for what she was, an overbearing, power-hungry leader who didn't care about the residents. Rachel ramped up her efforts, issuing fines to me, to my neighbors, anyone who had even looked like they were sympathetic to me. She couldn't intimidate me anymore though. I had the truth on my side, and now the neighborhood was starting to take notice. I wasn't the only one who had been harassed. But Rachel, she wasn't backing down either. She was furious, and I knew that meant she was going to escalate things. One night, as I was sitting at the kitchen table poring over my files, my phone rang. It was Dale, a neighbor and friend. I heard back from some of the guys. "Rachel's threatening to take you to court," Dale said, his voice steady but grim. "I figured as much," I said. "She's not gonna let this slide, but that's fine, I'm ready. What's your next move?" I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "I'm gonna hit her where it hurts." The next day I called in a favor with my lawyer. We started preparing the case: unlawful property seizure, abuse of HOA power, and harassment. I didn't care how long it took. I was going to make Rachel pay for what she had done, but I wasn't stopping there. I had an idea, one that would get under Rachel's skin like nothing else. It was the middle of the week when I got the call that would change everything. I was sitting in my living room, staring at the same stack of documents I'd been going over for the past few days, researching laws, gathering evidence, preparing for battle. The phone rang, pulling me out of my focus. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "David Grant," a voice asked. It was official, cold. "This is Officer Samuels, from the Bayview Police Department. I need you to come down to the impound lot. Your boat's been seized." I froze. "What? My boat? Seized? What are you talking about?" "There's been a request from the HOA to have it removed due to parking violations. It's already been towed and impounded." I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. No, this is a mistake. My boat is on my property. I'm just the messenger," Officer Samuels said. "The HOA has filed a complaint. It's out of my hands now." I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. Rachel had crossed a line. She'd taken it too far. I grabbed my jacket and headed straight for the impound lot, trying to breathe through the rage building in my chest. Rachel had stolen my boat while I was at work. No notice, no explanation, just a simple, cold act of control. When I arrived at the lot, I could see the boat from the entrance tied down under a tarp, sitting in the sun like some kind of criminal. The impound lot was as sterile as any place where you feel the weight of bureaucracy. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, metal, and frustration. I walked up to the front office, where an old clerk sat behind the counter, clearly not caring about the drama unfolding outside. "I'm here to get my boat," I said, holding up my ID. "It was taken illegally." The clerk looked up, unimpressed. "You'll need to pay the fee, then we can release it." "What fee?" I asked, stepping closer. "That boat is mine, and there's no legal reason for it to be here. This is a wrongful seizure, and I intend to fight it." She handed me a piece of paper listing the charges. The total fee for retrieving my boat was over $1,000. "Look," I said, clenching my fists. "I'm not paying this. I'm not paying for something that was taken from me without my permission." She shrugged. "You want it back? That's the cost. Take it or leave it." I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was about principle. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about a boat. This was about control. It was about Rachel's need to impose her will on everyone, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. That night, I called up Jake, my lawyer. "Jake, I need you to file a complaint, a legal one. Rachel's gone too far. She's had my boat taken from my property without any legal right." Jake's voice was calm but firm on the other end. "David, I've seen these types of tactics before. We've got a good case. We'll get it back." But even as Jake spoke, I knew that wasn't enough. Rachel wasn't just going to back down, she was going to keep pushing. And if I didn't do something to take control, she would continue to crush people like me. The following morning, I walked outside, my eyes falling on the empty space where the boat should have been. It was like something was missing. It wasn't just the boat, it was the symbol of my family. The memories tied to that boat were deep and irreplaceable. And now Rachel had taken that from me. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. I reached out to the neighbors who had supported me. The ones who hated Rachel's heavy hand. They were fed up too. "We need to fight back," I told them. "I'm taking this to the next level." David's friend and neighbor Carl was the first to show up at my door. He was a burly guy, a truck driver by trade, and he wasn't the kind to back down either. "You're not going to let this go," are you?" he asked as I explained the situation. "She stole your damn boat." "No," I said, pacing the living room. "I'm not letting this go. I'm going to expose her. I'm going to show this entire neighborhood what kind of person Rachel really is." Carl crossed his arms. "You need a plan then. You can't just wait for her to make the next move." I nodded. "I know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn her perfect little world upside down." I spent the next few days working quietly, gathering information, talking to more neighbors. It became clear that Rachel wasn't just picking on me. She'd been doing this to others. Small fines here, ridiculous violations there, until she had everyone on edge. And that's when the idea hit me. If Rachel thought she could control me, I was going to show her just how easy it was to turn the tables. The plan was simple but brilliant. It wasn't about just getting my boat back. It wasn't even about winning the legal battle, though I was going to make sure that happened. No, it was about sending a message. I would do something Rachel would never see coming. I'd turn her HOA-controlled pool into a duck pond. Rachel loved that damn pool. It was her pride and joy, the centerpiece of her perfect community. It was the place she'd organized countless HOA gatherings, and she had it locked down with all the rules and regulations that made her feel important. But what if I took that from her? What if I turned that pristine pool into something she could never control? I called up Carl and a few other neighbors who were fed up. They were all in. They didn't want to be pushed around anymore. We worked quickly. We gathered materials, tarp, hoses, makeshift barriers, and a few carefully selected ducks. I figured that would make Rachel really feel the sting. That night, we set the plan in motion. The next morning, Rachel arrived to her perfect pool, only to find a scene she'd never expected. A duck pond where her pristine pool had once been. Ducks were waddling around, some swimming in the water we'd set up, others lounging on the makeshift grass. The look on Rachel's face when she saw the transformation was priceless. She stormed to the pool, furious, ready to call the cops, but before she could make a scene, I stepped forward. "You've crossed the line, Rachel," I said, calm and collected. "You want to control everything around here? Well, how about you start with something you really care about?" Her jaw dropped. The HOA's perfect image, gone in an instant, and she was the one who had made it all possible. Rachel stood there, her mouth hanging open, unable to process what was happening in front of her. The once pristine pool was now an utter mess. Ducks waddling around, water splashing over the edge, and the whole neighborhood watching with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The power she'd clung to for so long was crumbling right in front of her eyes. "You think this is funny?" Rachel snapped, her eyes blazing with fury. I stood firm, my arms crossed. "I think you've spent too long thinking you can control everything in this neighborhood, Rachel." The boat was just the beginning. Her face went from red to pale in an instant. For the first time, she didn't know what to do. She hadn't anticipated this kind of rebellion. No one had ever really fought back against her in a way that mattered before. But that's exactly what I was doing. "I'll have you all arrested for this," she shouted, taking out her phone and dialing the police. I didn't budge. "Call them. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I've done my homework. You can't do a damn thing about this." Rachel's hands were shaking as she held her phone, and for a moment I thought she might just crumble. But then she steeled herself, dialing 911 like she had some final card to play. I wasn't worried though. I knew the law was on my side. This wasn't just some petty act of revenge. It was about taking back what was mine, what was ours, as a community. As I watched Rachel make the call, I saw the group of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk start to murmur amongst themselves. There was something about seeing the perfectly controlled HOA system fall apart in front of them that brought out a sense of empowerment. They were starting to wake up. For too long, they'd been silent, afraid to rock the boat. But the sight of Rachel's carefully manicured world falling apart was starting to make them realize they didn't have to live in fear anymore. I walked over to the group, making sure I didn't seem too smug, even though I couldn't help the grin tugging at my lips. "All right, folks, show's over," I said, raising my voice. "We've done what we came here to do. We've got to finish what we started." Carl, standing a few feet away, grinned back at me. "You've definitely shaken her up. Didn't think she'd go this far, but I guess it was bound to happen. When you poke a bear, you get the claws." I nodded, but my mind was already working ahead. I couldn't let this stand as just a petty prank. Rachel was too smart, too vindictive to back off from one embarrassment. I knew she'd be coming after me, after us, harder than ever. But I wasn't done. "We've got one shot to finish this right," I said, turning to face Carl. "She won't stop until she's made us pay, but there's something she doesn't know about me." Carl raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "She's already playing checkers. I'm playing chess." The next few days felt like a slow build to the showdown I knew was coming. As Rachel tried to figure out how to regain control, I kept working quietly, gathering allies and making sure everything was set in motion for the final act. I knew the media would be buzzing, and I made sure to send a few strategically placed messages to local reporters who had already picked up the story of the boat heist. I didn't want Rachel to think this was just a simple nuisance. No, I was going to hit her where it would hurt the most, her pride. And when I was done, her reputation would be irreparably damaged. It was the following Friday when I put my plan into action. The HOA had scheduled an official meeting, and of course, Rachel would be there, likely trying to drum up support for her counterattack. But I had one last move to play. I knew that if I showed up in the right way, with the right people by my side, the entire board would have no choice but to back down. I showed up to the meeting early, walking into the room like I owned the place. Rachel was already there, flanked by her usual board members, each with their clipboard in hand, ready to make their move. But I wasn't worried. I had the neighborhood behind me now, and the timing was perfect. I took a seat at the front, setting down a thick folder I'd prepared. Inside was everything I needed: legal documents, signatures, the media coverage I'd secured, and a counter-petition from over 60 residents who were fed up with Rachel's reign. When Rachel saw the petition, her eyes went wide. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The whole neighborhood had turned on her, and there was no coming back from that. As the meeting started, I stood up and addressed the group. "Let's get one thing straight. You all know what's been happening here. This is not about boats or a pool. This is about control. Rachel's been abusing her power for years, fining people, seizing property, intimidating neighbors into silence. And we're done." I gestured to the folder. "What I have here are legal records showing that Rachel's HOA is operating outside the boundaries of its jurisdiction. This petition," I held it up, "is signed by the majority of residents who are sick and tired of being bullied." The room was quiet. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "You're done, Rachel. The people you've been hurting are standing up now, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Her face was flushed with anger, but she had nowhere to turn. The people who once bowed to her were now looking at her like she was the problem. The board meeting ended early, and Rachel's control over the neighborhood was officially over. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Over the following weeks, Rachel and her supporters resigned one by one. The HOA as it existed fell apart, and the community started to rebuild itself, free from the clutches of overbearing rules and intimidation. David walked away from the fight victorious, but he knew the victory wasn't just his own. The whole neighborhood had learned something from this battle, that when you stand up for what's right, even the most powerful forces can be toppled. The community had reclaimed its freedom, and the boat, symbolizing his father's legacy, was returned. The days following the board meeting felt like a weird kind of silence, the calm before another storm. But this time, it wasn't the storm I'd feared, it was the one Rachel was brewing in her own desperate attempts to regain control. She was cornered, humiliated, and fighting with everything she had left. But I had already played my hand, and the neighborhood was finally starting to see who Rachel really was. 2 days after the meeting, my phone rang, and I saw Rachel's name on the screen. I didn't even bother to pick up. I wasn't interested in whatever manipulative speech she had planned. It wasn't just the boat anymore. She had taken this too far, and I wasn't about to let her weasel her way back into power. The voicemail she left was almost comical. "David, I hope you're proud of what you've done. You've not only jeopardized your own standing in this community, but you've also cost everyone else. I'll have you know that I'm not finished with this yet. I'll do whatever it takes to expose you." It was like she had read straight from a How to Lose Gracefully manual. Her desperation was palpable, and in that moment I knew I had her. She was trying to make me the villain in this scenario, to turn the community against me. But I wasn't about to fall for it. I'd already turned the tables, and now I was about to turn up the heat. The very next morning, I went straight to the Bayview Gazette and met with Lisa Garland. I could tell by her raised eyebrow and the slight grin on her face that she had been following the story, and she was just waiting for the moment when she could bring the house down. We need to put her on blast, Lisa. The HOA isn't just about one boat anymore. Rachel's been doing this for years. She's been using her position to force her will on this entire community, and now it's time for everyone to know who she really is. Lisa nodded. I agree. The public deserves to know what's really going on here, and the more I read about Rachel, the more I'm convinced that she's a piece of work. I'm running a full-piece front page. I smiled. That's exactly what I need. Let's take her down, piece by piece. She got to work immediately. She pulled up her research, including previous complaints from other residents, snippets of legal complaints, and of course Rachel's own words. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Rachel had been slipping for months, using the HOA to mask her insecurities, exploiting people's fear of consequences. Now it was time for her to face the consequences of her own actions. The article hit the next day. The headline alone made my blood run cold. HOA President Rachel Whitmore accused of abuse of power, illegal seizure of property. I couldn't have asked for a better opening. Lisa detailed everything, from the boat incident to the many complaints from residents who'd been intimidated or threatened by Rachel. She even included quotes from some of the quieter residents who had finally found their courage to speak out. The dam had broken, and the water was rushing fast. The piece highlighted Rachel's overreaching tactics and even pointed out her tendency to push neighbors out of the neighborhood through unfair fines and demands. It was raw, it was honest, and it was exactly what needed to be said. By the time the article made its rounds, Rachel was a pariah. People were coming out of the woodwork, neighbors I'd never heard from before, all reaching out to me with their own horror stories of dealing with her. They'd been afraid to speak up, but now that the truth was out, they were ready to join the fight. It wasn't just my victory anymore. This was our fight, and the community was starting to take back what had been stolen from them. A few hours after the article hit, the phone rang again. This time I picked it up. David. Rachel spat, her voice low with fury. You think this is over? You think you can just destroy everything I've worked for? You're making a huge mistake. I leaned back in my chair, grinning to myself. You think I'm the one who's destroying things, Rachel? You've been destroying this neighborhood for years. All I've done is expose the truth. She took a deep breath, the sound almost like she was struggling to keep her composure. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll see. I didn't need to listen to the rest. It was the same empty threats I'd heard from her 1,000 times, but this time, I was ready. And this time, she wasn't going to get away with it. That night, I got a call from Carl. He was on fire with excitement. You're not going to believe this, he said, barely able to contain himself. Rachel's resigning. She's already sent the email to the board, and she's trying to make it sound like it's her choice. She's quitting. I couldn't believe it. I had figured Rachel might try to cling to power for a little longer, but this was a total surrender. I thought back to all the times she'd used her position to push people around, how she thought she was untouchable, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that had undone her. The next few days were filled with phone calls, messages, and people coming up to thank me for standing up to Rachel. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. Where once there had been fear, now there was a sense of unity. People felt empowered to speak their minds, to push back against the rules that Rachel had enforced for so long, and it felt good. Rachel's resignation email was sent to the entire HOA community, and her message was thinly veiled with a sense of bitterness. But it was clear, she was done. The board members who had been her loyal supporters began to step down as well. Without Rachel at the helm, the HOA lost its grip on the neighborhood. As the community began to breathe a little easier, I stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The boat was back where it belonged, safely docked by the shore. It was more than just a piece of property. It was the symbol of the battle I'd fought, and won. The HOA's reign was over, and as for Rachel Whitmore, she was just a chapter in a story of justice served. The day after Rachel's resignation, the neighborhood was in full celebration. People were talking in the streets, shaking hands, clinking beers, and finally allowing themselves to breathe again. I stood outside, looking out over the now calm lake. The boat was back where it belonged. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight of the HOA's control had lifted. But I knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Rachel might have stepped down, but she wasn't the type to go quietly into the night. If anything, I knew she would lash out in whatever way she could. I'd already exposed her for what she was, but that didn't mean she wouldn't try to drag me through the mud one last time. I had seen enough of Rachel's manipulative behavior to know she wasn't going to let her defeat go unnoticed. She was a person who needed to feel like she was in control, and now that she'd been publicly humiliated, I had a feeling she wasn't going to just disappear. I was right. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, just a few days after Rachel resigned. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the feeling in my gut told me who it was. David Grant, a voice asked when I answered. Yes, I said, bracing myself for the worst. This is Officer Samuels, from the Bayview Police Department. We have a matter we need to discuss regarding your recent actions and the alleged damage caused to the HOA pool. My stomach dropped. Damage. That's what Rachel was calling it, a pool that was now filled with ducks. What exactly are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There's been a formal complaint made about the condition of the pool. Rachel Whitmore has filed a report claiming the pool was vandalized, and there's a pending investigation, Samuels said flatly. I could practically hear Rachel's voice in the background, her hands shaking with rage as she told her side of the story. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. Rachel was playing the long game, trying to get back at me any way she could, and now she was using the legal system to do it. I sighed, realizing where this was headed. Look, officer, there was no vandalism. The pool wasn't damaged, there were ducks in it. The HOA had no right to control that pool in the first place. What Rachel is doing is a desperate attempt to save face after losing everything. The officer paused for a moment. I understand your position, Mr. Grant, but I need you to come down to the station and discuss this further. We need to settle this before it goes any further. I knew what I had to do. Fine, I'll be there. When I arrived at the station, I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about a public battle between me and Rachel, one that had turned into a legal war. I walked into the interrogation room, where I was greeted by Officer Samuels, who motioned for me to sit. This is about more than a pool, isn't it? He asked, his voice calm, professional. I nodded. Yes, it is. Rachel's using her power as a means of retaliation. I've been fighting the HOA for months, trying to get the truth out. The boat, the fines, everything she's done. It's all part of her agenda to keep control. Samuel sat across from me, folding his hands. We've reviewed the evidence, and we've heard both sides. But here's the thing, Mr. Grant. Rachel still has some influence in the community. We don't want this to escalate. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. She stole my boat, she had it impounded illegally, and now she's making false claims about property damage, hoping to force me into a corner. I'm not the one escalating this. Rachel is. She's the one who's been abusing her power. She's the one who has to answer for what she's done. Samuels didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing my words. I'm not asking you to fight with her anymore, David, he said, his voice softening. I just need you to cooperate. Let's try to settle this. I stood up, my frustration rising. I've cooperated for months. I'm done cooperating. I left the station feeling more determined than ever. Rachel had pushed me to this point. She'd stolen my property, used her position to bully neighbors, and now she was using the legal system to try and trap me into a corner. I wasn't going to let her win. I called Jake as soon as I got back to my car. Jake, I need you to file a countersuit. Rachel's trying to make this more than it is. We're going on the offensive. Jake's voice was steady. All right, let's take the fight to her. We'll file for a defamation suit and hold her accountable for the damage she's caused to your reputation. The next few days were a blur. Jake and I put together the legal case, and I worked quickly to gather more support from the community. I wanted to make sure Rachel knew I wasn't backing down. If she thought she could drag me through the mud and intimidate me into silence, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The day the lawsuit was filed, I stood in front of the house, looking out over the same lake that had been the backdrop to so many memories with my dad. This lake was mine now, not Rachel's. This community was mine too. I was going to make sure it stayed that way. I wasn't just fighting for my boat anymore, I was fighting for everyone who had been under Rachel's thumb, too afraid to speak up. And as I turned back to the door, I knew I was finally going to win this battle. No matter how hard Rachel fought, no matter how far she went, she was out of moves. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind. The lawsuit had gone through, and everything was moving faster than I anticipated. The entire community rallied behind me, and as word spread, people began to realize what had really been going on. Rachel's empire of manipulation and fear had come crumbling down like a house of cards, and there was no putting it back together. It wasn't just the legal victory that felt satisfying, it was the look on Rachel's face when she realized she had lost everything. The boat, the pool, the fines, and most importantly, her grip on the community were all gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood wasn't divided. The people who had once feared Rachel were now starting to speak up, and they did it with confidence, knowing they weren't alone anymore. But the real turning point came when the final court ruling came through. Rachel was legally liable for the wrongful seizure of my boat, the harassment, and the emotional distress she had caused, not just to me but to several others in the neighborhood. She was ordered to pay a fine, and her name was officially removed from the HOA board. I didn't feel gloating satisfaction when I read the ruling. Instead, I felt a deep sense of relief. This wasn't just about winning against Rachel, it was about restoring balance to a community that had been shaken by fear. People were standing up for themselves, and they were doing it together. And I had been the catalyst for that change. 2 days later, I walked down to the dock to inspect the boat. It was just the way I remembered it, pristine, ready to take out on the water once more. The sunlight bounced off the hull, and for the first time since my father passed, I felt like he was with me, guiding me through it all. I ran my hand along the boat's side, remembering the days my dad would show me how to fix a small crack or clean the engine. Those afternoons on the lake weren't just about fishing, they were about learning, growing, and understanding what it meant to fight for what's yours. The boat wasn't just a boat, it was a legacy. And in reclaiming it, I'd reclaimed something far more important: my voice, my independence, and my place in this neighborhood. The phone call came right after that moment of reflection. It was Carl, one of the first neighbors to support me. "Nate, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice shaking with excitement. "You know the board, it's done. All of Rachel's cronies are gone. And get this, everyone else voted in new people. People who actually care about the neighborhood." I couldn't help but grin. This wasn't just about getting back at Rachel, it was about setting things right for everyone. The board was now made up of people who genuinely cared about the community, people who wanted to ensure that no one else would have to deal with the kind of abuse Rachel had inflicted on all of us. Carl continued, "You did it, man. You not only got your boat back, you changed everything for us." I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of pride that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about winning, it was about seeing the shift in the community, a shift I had started. Later that week, the community celebration was held at the now famous Lakeview Shores, and this time it wasn't just another HOA-mandated event. This was a party, a celebration of freedom, of taking back control. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue as neighbors gathered in the park, free from the weight of oppressive rules. I walked through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging stories with people I hadn't even realized had been living under Rachel's thumb for so long. There was Maggie, my neighbor, who had been living in fear of fines for something as simple as having an extra potted plant on her porch. There was Dale, who had been slapped with ridiculous fines for his unsightly garden. Now they were all smiling, finally free to be themselves. Carl was standing by the grill, flipping burgers, his hands dirty but his face full of joy. He saw me and gave a thumbs up. "Good to have you back, Nate," he said, with a wide grin. "This place wouldn't be the same without you." I smiled, tipping my cap. "I just did what any neighbor would do." Carl laughed, shaking his head. "No, you did something most of us were too afraid to do. You stood up, and now look at us." As the sun set over the lake, I stood with Maggie and Carl, looking out at the water. The boat was sitting proudly at the dock, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. "You know," Maggie said, her voice soft, "I didn't realize how much we had to fight for until it was almost too late." I nodded. Sometimes it takes someone to take that first step, but now, everyone's doing it. And that was the truth. Everyone was standing up now, not just for their property but for their rights. Rachel had tried to divide us, but in the end it was her that had been divided from the very community she sought to control. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat on the porch by myself. The night air was cool, the stars glittering above. I took a deep breath and let the stillness settle in. I thought about my father again, the way he used to sit on this porch with me, telling me stories about life, about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seemed impossible. I had finally taken his advice, and in doing so, I'd changed the entire course of this neighborhood. The boat was back, but more than that, the community was too. And as the sound of crickets filled the night, I realized something I hadn't known before. Victory wasn't just about winning, it was about giving others the courage to stand up too. And if you're watching this video while dealing with your own HOA nightmare, remember, never underestimate the power of someone who understands the rules and has the patience to wait for the perfect moment to use them. Comment below if you've ever had to stand up to an HOA and reclaim what was rightfully yours. Let me know how you fought back and what you've learned in the process. You're not alone in this fight. Let's hear your stories.